Sometime around the 12th century, something very strange, almost unexplainable happened in Europe. You see, for a while things were not going well for the West. The early Crusades didn't deliver any meaningful results. What they did bring back, though, was a fresh batch of heresies imported from Asia. The situation got messy enough that a crusade against heretics eventually had to be launched by French knights against their own countrymen. Economy was also dragging behind. Islamic cities like Baghdad or Damascus dwarfed even the largest European capitals. And adding injury to insult, in the middle of the 14th century, the Black Death has wiped out up to 3/4 of Europeans' population. So, as a manager of an imaginary hedge fund, I would probably stay away from European markets, thus making the most fatal mistake in my imaginary career. Because, like I said, around the 12th century, boom, something has turned around in Europe. Of course, in Italy, the change is the most noticeable. First comes Giotto, and with just one painting, the famous Kiss of Judas, transforms the whole concept of visual art. And then, it's almost like a weird reign of geniuses pours over Italian land. In Giotto's footsteps follow Botticelli with his Primavera, and Titian, and Giorgione, and Raphael, all the way up to Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and Leonardo's Last Supper. And it's not just about individual artists. The whole Italian cities enter an architectural race, trying to one-up each other in elegance and grandeur. So, in Florence, the famous Duomo is erected. In Milan, a marble miracle suddenly materializes. In Rome, St. Peter's Cathedral finally satisfies the ambitions of papacy. In a word, Renaissance in Italy suddenly is in full bloom. Now, if you corner the nearest history professor you can find and demand an explanation of this massive boost, they'll probably start talking about the medieval climate optimum, population growth, and the emergence of new trade routes that enriched the cities of Italy. What they probably will not mention, however, is an interesting coincidence. It was precisely in the 12th century that Catholic theologians finally formalized a concept unique to the medieval church. You will not find an equivalent among Protestants or Eastern Orthodox Christians. The name of that concept was purgatory. So, what if I tell you that the idea of horrible yet temporarily punishment of sinners after death, which included, but was not limited to, tortures with unbearable hellish fire, that this very concept gave a crazy boost both to European culture and economy? The idea might seem absurd, but let's explore it together. Maybe it's not that insane after all. First of all, the idea of posthumous punishment is unique to Christianity. In classical Greek religion, death was kind of it. You die, you become a shadow of yourself, you lose all memories, and forever wander across the dark plains of Hades. To be fair, even back then, not everyone was satisfied with that idea. Least of all Plato. "Come on," said he, "it cannot be that simple." So in one of his dialogues, namely Phaedo, he proposed the idea of purification after death. Any of your bad habits, say vaping or gaming addiction, all those filthy websites which I'm not supposed to mention on YouTube, all those vices leave a sort of spiritual scar on your soul. And according to Plato, after death, the soul has to rid itself of those stains before ascending to the higher spheres. But this remained Plato's personal philosophical speculation. Those ideas never became an actual religious doctrine. By the way, the fact that I am familiar with Plato's teaching gives you an idea of how little my chances are of landing a real job. My name is Alexei Pashkov, by the way. I'm the brain behind this channel, and making videos on culture and history is pretty much all I know how to do. So, I have a little favor to ask. If you like my work so far, please subscribe to the channel. For you, it's just one click, but it might be precisely the thing that will keep me out of McDonald's uniform. So, thank you in advance. And now back to our topic. As for Judaism, the religion that directly preceded Christianity, it paid even less attention to the afterlife. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Those words seem to leave very little room for the idea of life after death. So, early Christians had to develop the concept of the afterlife almost from scratch, and they had very little to work with. you might be surprised by just how little the New Testament actually tells us about what awaits us after death. A few vague references are scattered throughout the Gospels, but that is pretty much it. However, Catholic theologians were always notorious for their ability to stitch together different biblical passages, reinterpret them, read between the lines, and ultimately produce what are essentially theological quilts. Quilts which nevertheless pass for official doctrine in Catholic teaching. Invention of Purgatory is a true masterclass in such theological trickery. So, let's look at the initial pieces of the puzzle. First of all, we have the Gospel of Matthew, in which the second coming of Christ and the last judgment is described. Matthew says, "When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats. And those shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal." The first key idea here is finality of the judgment. Righteous go to heaven, sinners go to hell. There is absolutely no wiggle room left. The second idea is eternity of the punishment. Bible clearly states that the suffering of sinners is everlasting. Finally, and that's an important distinction, Matthew specifically describes the judgment which will happen at the end of times. But then, in Luke 16, we have something different, a story of a rich man and Lazarus. Rich man goes to hell after death, and Lazarus to some place of joy, described as Abraham's bosom. And yet they still communicate. And in hell he lift up his eyes, being in torments, and seeth Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. And he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that thou in thy lifetime received thy good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and thou art tormented. And besides all this, between us and you there is a great gulf fixed, so that they which would pass from hence to you cannot, neither can they pass to us that would come from this. So this one is a little tricky. On the one hand, the text clearly states that two places, one of joy and one of torment, are separated, and that border cannot be crossed. On the other hand, the rich man begs for mercy, which implies that his horrible condition is not ultimately fixed. His suffering can be eased. Also, the rich man goes to the place of torment immediately after death, which implies that the realm of his punishment cannot be similar to the one of which Matthew was speaking. So, from here we can already extract the concept of two different places of punishment, one eternal and one temporal. And finally, there is this obscure verse from the 1 Corinthians, If any man's work abide, which he hath built thereupon, he shall receive a reward. If any man's works shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire. Obviously, interpreting this requires a whole different level of theological skill. But two key ideas are noticeable. First, cleansing by fire. Second, ultimate salvation after the cleansing. Those are your main biblical ingredients. Add to this a handful of mystical texts and visions, a pinch of theological inventiveness, and a spoon of sophisticated reasoning. And here you go. The fully developed concept of purgatory is ready to be served by the 12th century. So, purgatory is the third place, a realm somewhere between hell and heaven. The name itself reveals its purpose. Souls undergo suffering there, and through them are purified, freed from the burden of earthly sins. In essence, the creation of purgatory was presented as an act of divine mercy. It gives us a chance to atone for those smallest sins we failed to make up for during our lifetime. But Catholic theologians didn't stop there. They kept reasoning like this. Post-mortem punishment is not fixed. Every sin committed during life can also be atoned for during life, through good deeds, for example, or by making donations to the church. And whatever remains unpaid by the time you die gets settled into purgatory throughout suffering. So in a way, every person ends up with two spiritual savings accounts. You can make deposits in either one, it makes no difference. What matters is saving up enough so that you may comfortably retire into heaven. If by now the whole thing is starting to sound less like theology and more like a financial audit, you are not mistaken. Historians actually call it exactly that, the economy of grace. And the next step in theological reasoning followed precisely the same economic logic. What if someone makes a deposit on your behalf? Say a wife builds a church in memory of her late husband. Would that good deed, her contributing to the church, shorten his time in purgatory? The Catholic theologians answered, yes, absolutely. And this is where they sharply diverge from other Christian traditions. For both Protestants and Orthodox Christians, the idea that the living can alter the fate of the dead borders on blasphemy. Yes, we may pray for those who have passed away out of simple human compassion, but to assume that we are capable of influencing the outcome of divine judgment is to take on far too much. Only God decides the fate of a soul after death. Catholicism, however, leaves considerably more wiggle room, and boy did they wiggle, because eventually this whole concept degenerated into the practice of selling indulgences. Just pay a representative of the Pope a certain amount of money and receive an official document reducing the time your deceased relative would spend burning in purgatory. There were even price lists. This much to shave off a year of punishment, this much for 10 years, and this much for 1,000. The whole business, built on naive faith and human suffering, looked ugly. And this was exactly what triggered Luther. Not on my watch, he said, and challenged the papacy on this issue, jump-starting the Reformation. However, this whole concept of purgatory also had a surprisingly positive implication. To fully appreciate it, I would like first to briefly tell you a story from a little-known early Christian text called The Passions of Saint Perpetua. Perpetua, a devout Christian awaiting execution in prison, has a dream. Her little brother, who had died a few years earlier from some kind of terrible ulcer on his face, appears before her. The horrific wound still disfigures his skin. He looks pale, exhausted, and tormented by thirst. Nearby stands a basin of water, but the boy is too small to reach it. Perpetua wakes up with a terrible realization. Her brother is suffering for his sins he committed while alive. So she begins praying for his soul. The following night he visits her again, but this time the scars on his face are smaller and the basin of water is lower, almost within his reach. Encouraged by the first signs, Perpetua continues praying. And then, in her third dream, she finally sees her brother healthy and joyful, dressed in clean clothes and completely healed. The fountain of pure water is now always within his reach. Perpetua understands that his soul is saved by her prayers. Now, can you imagine the psychological impact such a story would have had on people? I think, first of all, it gave people hope and relief. It allowed them to feel that their loved ones were still there, still within reach somehow. Secondly, it encouraged a much more active attitude toward life. Think about it. For both Protestants and Orthodox Christians, the death of a son or a husband is ultimately the end. But for a Catholic who embraces the concept of purgatory, death is not the end. On the contrary, it is only the beginning, because now those alive have a mission of enormous importance ahead of them. They must do everything in their power to ease the suffering of those gone. It inspires, it gives purpose and energy that has to be translated into concrete action like building churches, for example, or decorating family chapels, or donating to shelters for the poor and the homeless, all of which in turn require trained architects, artists, and sculptors. You see where I'm going with this? The Medici hired Michelangelo to decorate their family chapel, where services were held in memory of deceased members of the family. The result was some of his most famous masterpieces: Day, Night, Dawn, and Dusk. In Milan, the Rucellai family built a chapel intended for the salvation and the remembrance of their own souls, and the chapel looks like a miniature replica of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. But perhaps the most striking example is the Scrovegni chapel. Reginaldo Scrovegni was a successful moneylender, a profession that, by the standards of the time, practically guaranteed him a long stay in purgatory. Dante, by the way, placed him there in the Divine Comedy. His son, Enrico Scrovegni, genuinely tried to ease his father's fate. So he spent a considerable portion of his inherited fortune hiring the greatest painter of his age, Giotto, to decorate the family chapel. In the end, it became one of the most recognizable masterpieces of the early Renaissance. As you can see, the concept of purgatory ensued the so-called economy of grace, which in turn encouraged rich people to invest into architecture and art. The concept of purgatory was finalized in the 12th century. The Renaissance period began around the same time. It all fits. Now, am I saying that purgatory was the only factor leading to flourishing of Renaissance? Certainly not. Am I saying it played a significant role? Certainly yes. Finally, a non-rhetorical question for you. Do you think that exposing those obscure and sublime connections which drive history is one of the most exciting things in life? If so, please like this video. I think we deserve it fair and square. Also, if you are interested in how philosophical ideas can drive history in the most substantial and even cruel way, here is a video about modern Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin. Some say that if it wasn't for his ideas, the whole Ukrainian conflict could be avoided altogether. So, give this video a try. Chances are you'll like it.